This episode of the Rise Kill Eat podcast is part of our devotional series. The Rise Kill Eat podcast devotionals are a series of weekly devotionals intended to help encourage anyone listening. A devotional is a consistent publication that features a passage or passages from Scripture, accompanied with context that connects to the passages from Scripture. These episodes are posted every Sunday morning to help you, the listeners, start your week off with some encouragement from a fellow outdoorsman. I hope you enjoy this week's devotional episode. During the ministry of Jesus, he often performed miracles. He healed sick and injured people with a touch of his hand, and sometimes he would even do this from a distance without even being within the proximity of the person being healed. He calmed storms in the sea by his spoken word, and he resurrected some that had even died. He made water turn into some of the best wine that anyone has ever tasted, and he made demons tremble by just being in the same area as them because they know the power that he holds. Amongst these countless miracles, Jesus also did something remarkable for large groups of people. After a long day of healing and teaching, evening was approaching, and the large crowd that had gathered to catch a glimpse of Jesus to hear him teach was still there on the shore where Jesus was. With darkness quickly approaching, the situation was beginning to make the disciples a little nervous and anxious because they did not have enough food to feed all these people, and it was quickly getting too late for them to travel back home in the darkness. They didn't have streetlights and flashlights, of course, back then, 2,000 years ago, so traveling in the dark was likely reserved for the skillful and not necessarily something that the everyday person participated in. But nonetheless, the disciples are becoming concerned with being able to feed all of these people that have shown up to hear Jesus and to be healed by him. Jesus then looks at them and says, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." At this point, I can imagine the disciples kind of wondering if they're even seeing the same thing that Jesus is seeing. There's a sea of people, 5,000 people, in fact, and Jesus casually looks at them and says to give them some food. One of them replies to Jesus and says, "We only have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish." Clearly, this isn't enough to feed a few thousand people, and their anxiousness is likely becoming more evident. But what happens next is the part that is, well, impossible. I say the word impossible because for people, this is literally impossible. But the beauty of knowing Jesus and knowing what he is capable of, impossible has become possible. God does impossible math in impossible circumstances. At this point, Jesus takes the basket of fish and bread and gives thanks to God. From there, the disciples began to pass around bread and fish, enough bread and fish that everyone there, everyone that was present, was fed and satisfied. In fact, there was so much that there were actually leftover bread and fish, more than they had even started with. This is one of those crazy stories that leaves you scratching your head and makes you wonder what in the world just happened. Surely this can't happen and somebody got it wrong somewhere, but that's exactly it. Nobody got it wrong. Jesus performs impossible things in impossible situations. There are many lessons that can come from this story, and many pastors, preachers, teachers, and ministers have used this very story to teach a variety of different things. But what I want to focus on is the sacrificial giving that took place and the trust in God to do something great. I think that it's important to note that what they gave to Jesus was all they had. They only had 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, and they gave it all to Jesus. They didn't just give him a little bit, they didn't give him some of it, they gave it all to him. They didn't say to him, "We will give you 2 loaves and one of these fish, and we'll hang on to the rest just in case you don't come through and we have some left over to use just in case." They didn't do this at all. They gave everything that they had to him, and he did something incredible with it. This same situation is true for our lives, and I'm talking to myself just as much as I am you guys, the listeners. Where am I holding back from Jesus? Is it in my career? Is it in my marriage? Is it in my relationship with my kids? Is it my finances, my prayer life, my hobbies? Where am I holding back from Jesus and keeping it to myself just in case he messes up and doesn't give me what I want? These are hard questions to ask ourselves, but I believe that whenever we open up and are honest about our answer, it will be revealed to us very quickly. I know that that is the case for me at least. So spend some time asking yourself these questions and work toward giving everything over to Jesus. Total surrender to Jesus isn't a sign of weakness, but it is actually the exact opposite. It is the ultimate sign of strength. To hand something over that we value to somebody else and let them take care of it takes a tremendous amount of strength to overcome, and that desire to keep hanging on is always evident. But letting go and allowing Jesus to take it over is something that's necessary in order for us to get to know Him more. When we hand it all to Jesus and let Him work in our lives, impossible things can happen, things that are far greater than we could ever have imagined. This week's message comes from the book of Matthew, specifically chapter 14, verses 13 through 21. However, this story can also be read in the book of Mark, chapter 6, verses 30 through 44, the book of Luke, chapter 9, verses 10 through 17, and the book of John, chapter 6, verses 1 through 15. Now, Matthew 14, verses 13 through 21 says, When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. As evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, This is a remote place, and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go into the villages and buy themselves some food. Jesus replied, They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat. We have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish, they answered. Bring them here to me, he said, and he directed the people to sit down on the grass. Taking the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the people. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, besides women and children. Thank you so much for joining me today for this week's episode of the Rise Kill Eat Devotionals. Be sure to connect with me on my social media accounts. On Instagram, you can find me at the handle at Rise Kill Eat. On Facebook, type in the URL facebook.com/RKEafield, and on Twitter at the handle at RKEafield. On behalf of myself and all of your fellow listeners, we hope you have a blessed week. Thank you.